She built her family's dream home, only to discover it was the stage for her own betrayal. Grace Whitman was the forgotten daughter, the one who paid every bill, laid every brick, and asked for nothing in return. But behind the freshly painted walls she restored, her own mother was plotting to erase her from the family entirely. This isn't just a story of betrayal. It's about the quiet ones who rise, the underestimated who return, and what happens when a woman finally stops asking for a seat at the table and builds her own. Stay with us. Because Grace didn't just fight back, she redefined what it means to belong. The ladder wobbled slightly beneath Grace Whitman's boots as she reached up to hook the last string of Christmas lights along the gabled roof of the family home. The Texas dusk painted the sky a dull orange, shadows stretching across the neatly trimmed lawn she had landscaped herself 6 months ago. It was a house she'd practically rebuilt from the foundation, her hands in every beam, every screw, every polished tile. And yet, it never really felt like hers. Through the slightly cracked second-floor window, voices drifted down. She paused mid-mash and breath-catching as she recognized the familiar tones of her mother and sister. "I don't want to spend Christmas with that loser!" Vanessa's voice rang out, unmistakably dismissive. A pause. "Let her finish the renovation, then cut her loose," Martha replied, calm as ever. "She's embarrassing. I can't believe she calls herself part of this family." Grace stayed frozen, one arm still reaching upward, her other hand clenched tightly around the gutter bracket, the metal biting into her palm. Her chest hollowed out like the beams she'd laid beneath the floorboards. The cold settled into her bones, not from the winter air, but from the clarity of betrayal. She descended slowly, each rung heavier than the last. The grass felt unfamiliar under her feet as she walked toward the garage, trying to steady her breath. There was a time when she would have confronted them, demanded an explanation, fought for a scrap of affection, a sliver of acknowledgement. But not now. Not after all these years. Inside, the living room sparkled with the kind of sterile perfection her mother cherished. Ivory drapes, crystal ornaments, the same porcelain reindeer set that had graced their mantel every Christmas since Grace was 10. She remembered, vividly, the first year she dared to suggest swapping them out for something rustic. Wood-carved, handmade. Martha had laughed. "We're not trying to look like a barn." She had meant more than just decoration. Grace entered the kitchen, where the scent of rosemary and garlic wafted from the prime rib she had been marinating for 3 days. The cookie dough was chilled, ready to be rolled and shaped by hand. She didn't do store-bought. Perfection, she had believed, might one day equal acceptance. She had been wrong. Even now, she could hear Vanessa upstairs, laughing. Probably with Bruce, her smug lawyer husband, who asked about Grace's cute little business as if she ran a roadside lemonade stand. Ryan, their father, would be in his study, swirling bourbon over an article no one asked him to write. Always more interested in op-eds than offspring. Grace reached for a dish towel, drying her hands automatically as she stared at the window over the sink. The lights she had just hung blinked back at her from the reflection in the glass. They sparkled against the siding she had replaced. The deck, her design. The staircase, her blueprint. Every corner of this house had her fingerprints, but it had never held space for her. She sat at the kitchen table, unmoving, the ticking wall clock suddenly thunderous in her ears. 34 years. 34 Christmases. 34 attempts to be seen not as a contractor, not as a utility, but as a daughter. A bitter smile touched her lips. She'd been funding their holidays for years. Her money. Her labor. Her time. The family trips? She paid. The renovation budget? Hers. Her name wasn't on the deed, but her blood was in the walls, and still she was the loser in their upstairs conversations. A single phrase came to her, one she hadn't allowed herself to think for a long time. It's time. Not for confrontation, not yet, but for clarity. She opened her laptop, pulled up a blank spreadsheet, and typed a title across the top in bold. Whitman House. Personal depression. She stared at the blinking cursor, then began entering numbers with mechanical precision. Paint costs, roofing labor, plumbing receipts, patio invoices. She pulled a folder from her bag, the one she kept in her truck, just in case. She'd been tracking everything since day one, more out of habit than suspicion. But now, the documentation felt like armor. From the dining room, she heard her mother humming some vintage carol, sweet and haunting, the same voice that had just called her an embarrassment. Grace closed her eyes, took a breath, and smiled. The next morning, the sun rose over the Whitman house like it always did, soft and golden, slanting through the tall windows Grace had installed herself. She stood in the driveway, coffee in hand, watching as the steam curled upward into the still December air. Her boots were dusty from yesterday's work. A faint soreness lingered in her shoulders, a familiar ache she had long since stopped resenting. Behind her, the house looked exactly as it should have. Restored, modernized, sturdy. And still, it was never her. Inside, the family had begun to stir. Ryan had already left for campus, no doubt wearing his usual navy blazer and oblivious air. Vanessa was in the guest bathroom using Grace's salon-grade hairdryer and no doubt leaving product all over the counter. Bruce had taken over the breakfast nook, murmuring into his Bluetooth headset about depositions and estate trusts, glancing up only to critique Grace's flooring choices. And Martha was sitting in her favorite spot by the bay window, newspaper in hand, her phone screen tucked just out of sight. Grace didn't speak as she re-entered the kitchen. She moved through the space with calculated calm, prepping breakfast for everyone like she always did. But today, each motion carried intent. The eggs cracked just a bit sharper. The knife on the cutting board moved with a surgeon's certainty. She plated everything neatly, arranged forks with precision, and laid down cloth napkins, ironed the night before, of course. "Grace," her mother said, looking up from the paper with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Vanessa mentioned how lovely the wreaths look. You've really outdone yourself again this year." Grace nodded, her lips forming a polite, practiced line. "Glad she approves." Martha blinked. "Don't be sarcastic, dear. It doesn't suit you." There it was. The familiar little jab. The woman who had never raised a hand but could wound with the flick of a syllable. Grace felt it, like a thorn under the nail, but said nothing. Vanessa floated in then, dressed in designer loungewear and sipping from a glass of pressed juice. "Mom, Bruce wants to talk to you about the trust documents again. He's got concerns about the timing." She barely glanced at Grace. "Oh, and thanks for finishing the deck stairs. Bruce nearly tripped last night." "I'll make sure the lawsuit papers are ready next time," Grace murmured. Vanessa laughed. Hoot. The breakfast table filled with idle chatter. Bruce muttered about tax codes, Martha talked about caterers for Vanessa's upcoming birthday, and Ryan, freshly returned, gave a disinterested nod in Grace's direction before diving into a monologue about market volatility. Grace sat in silence, listening to them talk about a life she had built but was never part of. She knew now more than ever that nothing she did, no act of loyalty, no sacrifice, no renovation, would ever make her enough for this family. Not because she hadn't tried, but because they had already decided who she was. Invisible, disposable. When the table was cleared and the dishwasher hummed its low, comforting rhythm, Martha gently patted Grace on the shoulder. "You've always been the practical one," she said with a tight smile. "And I mean that in the best way. You're not emotional like Vanessa. You're steady, reliable." Grace turned, meeting her mother's eyes with a calmness that made Martha pause. "Like a foundation," Grace replied. "Solid, useful. Until the house is finished, then no one thinks about it again." Martha didn't respond. Jess shifted uncomfortably and returned to her seat by the window. Later that afternoon, Grace found herself in her old bedroom, now stripped of most of its personality. The posters had long since been replaced by guest towels and neutral art. But in the closet, tucked inside an old toolbox, she found a folder she hadn't touched in years. Inside, her high school architectural drawings, photos of her first job site, business cards from suppliers who now called her by name. It was all proof of who she had become without their approval. She returned to the kitchen and poured herself a drink. Not wine like her mother, not whiskey like her father. Just black coffee. The way she liked it, no compromise. No apologies. Then, without hesitation, she opened her laptop again. The spreadsheet from the night before blinked back at her. She titled the next tab, Phase 1, Surveillance. Outside, the lights she had strung shimmered like they always did, festive, delicate, bright. But this year, Grace knew the truth. They weren't for celebration. They were camouflage. And she was done pretending. She was building something new now, not for them, for herself. The house was quiet in that strange post-lunch stillness. Grace moved through the hall like a shadow, careful not to let the floorboards creak beneath her steps. She had replaced most of them herself. She knew which ones groaned under pressure, which ones held secrets behind the drywall. Secrets were what she was after now. She paused at the door to her mother's study, once off-limits, now merely a room with an old desk, an upholstered chair, and a laptop with a new password. New, but not clever. Martha had always been proud of her wedding anniversary, Whitman 93. It worked on the third try. The screen lit up with Martha's digital world, folders neatly labeled in Martha's no-nonsense style. Household. Vanessa, retirement, legal, and then one tucked farther down, partially hidden under unrelated archives. Estate planning, private. Grace's pulse quickened. She glanced back at the hallway, still silent. Then she clicked. Inside were spreadsheets, emails, and scanned documents, some marked with Bruce's digital signature, others with Vanessa's name in bold headers. Grace clicked through, her breath growing shallow. Every file was a puzzle piece. Every subject line, another slap in the face. Trust restructure timeline. Grace's renovation completion. Property transition plan. Q1 review. She read in stunned silence as the plan unraveled. Once the renovation was completed, the trust fund would be officially revised, excluding her, consolidating all family property under Vanessa's name. The spreadsheet even estimated the projected increase in property value due to recent structural upgrades. The very work Grace had done. There was a line item labeled labor in count. Grace, as if she were a volunteer on a church project, not the owner of a 5-crew construction business. Her throat burned. She took screenshots, all of it, every document, every correspondence, copied them to a hidden drive she'd been keeping in her toolbox, the one she used for backup architectural files, now doubling as evidence storage. She was about to shut the laptop when an unexpected name caught her eye. B. Keller. It appeared in a thread labeled Personal, for your eyes only. She hesitated, then opened it. At first, the messages seemed innocuous. Brief notes about travel schedules, then compliments. You looked beautiful yesterday. Then coded phrases. Private rendezvous in Austin. Vague references to the transfer and our plan. Then came the one that made her blood run cold. Once G is out, we move forward. It'll all be worth it. Signed simply, B. Grace stared at the screen, unmoving. Her mother had a lover. That alone might have sent a ripple through any family, but not just any man. Brant Keller. Her father's best friend since college, godfather to Vanessa, a man who had been around since Grace was old enough to speak. She had grown up thinking of him as an uncle. He had given her a set of toy tools for her 6th birthday, the first spark that led to her career. He had shown up to her high school graduation with a camera and a grin, and now Now he was the one her mother called darling in secret emails, the man who had been waiting for Grace to finish the renovation so they could erase her entirely and start a new life. On her dime. Grace backed away from the laptop slowly, as if stepping away from a live wire. The past 34 years rearranged themselves in her mind. Her mother's evasive eyes. Brant's sudden distance, the cold efficiency with which she had been handed tasks. But never trust, never affection. They'd never planned to include her. They'd planned to use her. And now she knew. That night, Grace sat alone in the detached workshop behind the house, her laptop open on the drafting table. The air was cool, dust swirling in the amber light overhead. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, then moved with steady rhythm, transferring each saved screenshot, each thread of deception into a secure folder marked Phase 1 Evidence. She didn't cry. She didn't rage. Instead, she cataloged. It was her language, the quiet logic of blueprints, of structural integrity. And this was structural rot, hidden beneath layers of paint and plaster. She had spent her life reinforcing the cracks they left behind. Now she was mapping the fault lines. On the whiteboard near the workbench, she began a diagram. One circle, Martha Whitman. Beneath it, branching lines, affair with Brant, financial manipulation, estate transfer. Next circle, Bruce Brooks. Lines, legal advisor, document revisions, trust misdirection. Then Vanessa Brooks, beneficiary, emotional gaslighting, public face of the family, and finally Grace Whitman, financial provider, unacknowledged labor, elimination target. She stepped back to look at it. It resembled the structure of a building, but inverted, a kind of demolition plan. A knock came on the side door, light, hesitant. Grace wiped her hands on her jeans and opened it. It was Mrs. Rosa, their neighbor for nearly 20 years, sharp-eyed and warm in equal measure, always gardening or offering unsolicited advice on foundation drainage. "Sorry to bother you, mija," she said in her usual lilt. "I saw Brant leaving here again 2 nights ago. Thought he moved out west years ago?" Grace blinked. "You're sure it was him?" Mrs. Rosa raised an eyebrow. "He parked that old silver Lexus, walked right up to the side door, thought it was strange, but your maman said it was financial stuff." "Yeah," Grace said slowly. "Financial." "Your mother's always been particular," Mrs. Rosa added, her voice lowering. "But that man? I don't like the way he looks at things that don't belong to him." Grace smiled, tight-lipped. "Neither do I." After Rosa left, Grace added a small note to the bottom of the whiteboard. Witness confirmation, Rosa. She didn't know how far this conspiracy reached, but now it had a shape, and names, and timestamps. She was no longer a bystander in her own life. She was the architect of the reckoning. The next morning, under the pretense of checking local permits, Grace booked an appointment with an estate lawyer, not Bruce, a real one, at Whitaker and Jameson LLP. The senior partner, a wiry man in his 60s named Dennis Lang, reviewed the digital files with furrowed brows and deliberate nods. "You've got receipts, labor logs, photos, emails. This is more than enough to prove substantial financial contribution," he said. "But the deed isn't in my name," Grace said. "It's still theirs." Lang leaned back. "That complicates things, but the volume of financial involvement, especially from a private business account, gives you leverage, especially if fraud or conspiracy is involved." Is an affair part of the legal equation? If it impacts the handling of shared assets, absolutely. Grace exhaled slowly. "I'm not trying to destroy anyone. I just want to stop being erased." Lang gave her a measured look. "Then you've come to the right place." Back in her truck, Grace stared out at the Houston skyline. The sun was beginning to dip behind a wash of pink and gold. People were out shopping for gifts, planning holidays, living lives untouched by betrayal. She wasn't them, not anymore. She turned the key in the ignition and drove home, a different woman than the one who had arrived. The girl who once begged for a seat at the family table was gone. Now she was drafting the demolition blueprint, and she would be very, very precise. Grace's fingers moved with clinical control as she assembled the binder, page by page. Each tab was labeled in her precise handwriting: materials, labor, invoices, correspondence, witnesses. The final section, Phase 2, surveillance, remained slim but potent, a folder within a folder of compressed audio files, transcriptions, and screen captures. It had taken weeks, but she had it all now. Her mother's voice, her sister's contempt, Bruce's calculated words. She closed the binder and locked it inside a false drawer in her workshop desk. Her breath fogged the cold window as she glanced outside. A thin layer of frost was settling on the grass. The Texas winter, trying to assert itself for once. Inside the main house, she could hear the muted thud of footsteps. Vanessa's heels, clipped and arrogant. They had returned early from brunch. Grace didn't go inside, not yet. Instead, she crossed to the old metal locker against the far wall of the workshop and opened it. Inside was the original blueprint of the Whitman home, the one from decades ago, before her modifications. She had kept it not for nostalgia, but for contrast. She pinned it up on the corkboard next to the updated plans she had drawn for the renovation. Side by side, the difference was stunning. What once had been a cold, boxy structure was now warm, flowing, modern. The kitchen was open, the foundation reinforced. She had built gathering spaces, reading nooks, even designed a garden path for her mother's dream of a place for afternoon tea. It had never been for her. It had been for them. And now it would be her weapon. She turned on the small recorder on her workbench, marking the next entry. Log 14, December 17th, 3:42 p.m. Audio confirms conversation between Martha Whitman and Vanessa Brooks, includes explicit phrasing, "Let her pay for it, then cut her loose." Bruce mentioned legal strategy regarding removal of outside claims. Ryan Whitman appears unaware. Cross-reference with email from December 2nd. She clicked it off. The voice she heard on playback was steady, emotionless. That was good. That meant she was in control. That night, she baked cookies. Not out of habit, but necessity. She needed to be invisible again. Predictable. Grace, the agreeable eldest daughter, the one who kept traditions alive when everyone else was too busy or distracted. The smell of vanilla and cinnamon drifted through the house, coating the air like camouflage. As she loaded the cooling rack, she overheard Martha on the phone again. The tone was soft, intimate, almost girlish, nothing like the crisp command she used on Grace. "No, darling, she doesn't suspect a thing. She still thinks she's part of the plan. Once everything is signed—" "Yes, I promise. I love you too." The call ended with a sigh. Grace stood in the pantry, hands resting on the shelf next to the mixing bowls, eyes closed. She didn't need to record that call. She had enough. This wasn't about gathering more. It was about timing. Back in the workshop, she drafted the next step. The setting, the layout, the moment of reveal. She would need a date, a location, the players present. A family dinner? No, too expected. A holiday gathering? Too soon. Vanessa's birthday was in 3 weeks. Martha had already begun hinting at a celebration. Perfect. Grace pulled a blank note card from her drawer and began sketching. Not a floor plan this time, but a seating arrangement. At the head, herself. Opposite, Martha. At her sides, Vanessa and Bruce. Ryan slightly offset, neutral, unpredictable. This was no longer a blueprint for a home. It was a blueprint for reckoning. The first recording came through 2 days later. Grace sat in her truck with the heater humming, parked in the lot of a hardware supply store she frequented. She plugged in the flash drive, inserted her earbuds, and played the file. The audio was clean, clearer than she'd expected from the discreet device she had slipped behind the baseboard molding in the living room. Odessa had dropped by unannounced. Her voice was unmistakable. "Bruce Finalized the paperwork, she said, voice low but distinct. Now that the renovation's done, the legal grounds for cutting her out are solid. There was a pause, the sound of a teacup being set down. Then Martha, "Is this really necessary? She's still my daughter." "You said it yourself," Odessa replied sharply. "You can't stand spending Christmas with that loser. Make her pay for the renovation, then cut her loose." A woman in construction, it's embarrassing. Martha let out a long sigh. "You're right. We're already working on it. And I'm planning to leave all of the inheritance to you. And the plan with Brant, he's waiting. Ryan doesn't suspect a thing. Once the asset transfer is complete." The clip ended with a static hiss. Grace pulled the earbuds out slowly. The edges of the steering wheel dug into her palms as she gripped it tighter, willing herself not to scream. Her pulse beat in her ears like a war drum. They weren't just mocking her behind closed doors. They were executing a strategy. A betrayal orchestrated with spreadsheets and dinner parties. Cold, methodical, legal. Her mother's hesitation had been brief, a flicker, Billy, a last-minute performance of conscience before folding entirely into Odessa's plan. And Brant, the man her father still referred to as his oldest friend, the man she'd trusted, who had inspired her first love of tools and timber, he was waiting in the wings like a vulture. Waiting for the last screw to be driven into the walls Grace had raised. It was no longer enough to document. It was time to prepare the confrontation. That evening she sat alone in her workshop, staring at her whiteboard. Under the printed photos and email threads, she taped the transcription of the recording. Red ink circled Martha's words. "We're already working on it. Bran is waiting." Below that she wrote in block letters, "Timing is everything." She opened her spreadsheet again, now marked with several tabs, one for expenditures, one for legal risk, and another titled Psychological Leverage. She began listing family patterns, how her mother responded to conflict, how Odessa shifted blame, how Bruce attempted to redirect pressure through legal jargon. Her father was still an unknown, detached but not cruel. She suspected he knew less than anyone, but that wouldn't last. She added a new column labeled Detonation Points. Grace wasn't looking to destroy them out of malice, but she wanted them to feel the blast radius of what they had done. Not with screaming, not with revenge fantasies, with evidence, with truth. Delivered with the precision of a well-measured blueprint. The plan was forming now like an architecture project. Scope, budget, materials, timeline. The location was already set, Vanessa's birthday dinner. The cast was assembled. All that remained was execution. She printed out the transcript, sealed it in an envelope, and slid it into the growing pile labeled Live Reveal Assets. Then she reached for a fresh folder and scrawled the label in capital letters, PAZ3. In the quiet of the workshop, as the wind tapped against the tin roof and the scent of sawdust clung to the air, Grace allowed herself a rare, tight smile. She wasn't building their dream anymore, she was drafting their reckoning. The morning of Vanessa's birthday dawned pale and windless, a rare stillness hanging over the Whitman estate like a held breath. Grace stood in the dining room, long before anyone else had risen, the light just beginning to filter through the windows and wash over the mahogany table she had refinished herself 2 years earlier. It was the same table that had hosted every holiday, every forced celebration, every dinner where she'd been smiled at but never truly seen. Today, it would host something else entirely. The centerpiece had been arranged the night before. Eucalyptus leaves, cream-colored candles, and blush garden roses. Martha had chosen them, of course, perfection without soul. Grace adjusted the placement of the candles by 1/2 inch, just enough to make the symmetry hers. She moved with quiet purpose, laying out the place settings with surgical care. The china was heirloom, gold-rimmed, brought out only for occasions deemed worthy. Grace made sure to place her own setting at the head of the table. Martha would notice but say nothing in front of guests. Not today. Not on Vanessa's birthday. From her blazer pocket, Grace withdrew a slim black tablet. She placed it gently beside her plate, along with a printed folder sealed with a red tab. The folder contained every document, every email, every financial trail she had uncovered. The tablet held the recordings. The entire operation, coded, clean, legal, undeniable. Footsteps approached from the kitchen. Heels. "Martha." "Oh," her mother said upon seeing Grace. "You're up early." "Just wanted to make sure everything's set before the chaos begins," Grace replied without turning. Martha walked around the table, appraising. "The flowers are leaning. They should be tighter in the center." Grace leaned in, adjusted one stem, then smiled coolly. "Better?" Martha stared at her for a moment too long. "Yes," she said slowly. "That'll do." Ryan arrived next, carrying a bottle of Cabernet from the cellar. "Something nice for the occasion," he said, placing it near Grace's plate. He looked around, nodding. "Everything looks perfect. Your mother's touch, no doubt." Grace didn't respond. She was already watching the door, timing the choreography in her head. Vanessa and Bruce would arrive shortly. She'd confirmed with Martha the night before that they were bringing dessert and would be fashionably late. Perfect. At 5:32 p.m., the front door opened. "Happy birthday to me," Vanessa sang out, gliding into the foyer in a tight navy dress. Bruce trailed behind her, phone already in hand, murmuring something about a contract clause. Grace greeted them with a smile so warm it nearly cracked. "Welcome, you're just in time." Vanessa air-kissed her mother, winked at Ryan, and nodded curtly toward Grace. "Looks great. Very restoration hardware?" Bruce chuckled. "Nice table, Grace. Bet you got a deal on the stain." "Actually," Grace said, stepping forward, "I built it from salvaged cherry wood. Every panel hand-sanded, every joint mortised. Took me 6 weekends." Bruce gave a short laugh, then shrugged. "Still isn't beat Amazon Prime." Grace didn't flinch. She just walked to the head of the table and pulled out her chair. "Let's sit, shall we?" As everyone settled, Martha began pouring wine. Ryan droned about an editorial he'd just published. Vanessa fawned over the cake she brought from an overpriced bakery in the Heights. Bruce was texting under the table. It was ordinary, familiar, deceptively serene. Grace looked down at the red-tabbed folder next to her. Her fingers brushed its edge. They were all in their places now. The table was set. Dinner was about to begin. Grace waited until the plates had been cleared and the cake was halfway devoured, its pristine white frosting now a battlefield of crumbs and streaked forks. The wine had begun to do its work. Cheeks flushed, voices more relaxed, laughter looser. Even Bruce had put his phone down. She glanced at the clock. 7:11 p.m. Right on time. Grace rose slowly from her seat, lifting her wine glass. "I'd like to say a few words before we open gifts," she said, her tone even, almost warm. All eyes turned toward her. Martha's brows arched ever so slightly, a hand pausing mid-reach for her napkin. Vanessa leaned back in her chair, twirling her stemware. Bruce smirked. Ryan gave a tired nod. Grace raised her glass higher. "To family. To the people who raise us, who teach us about love, loyalty, and what it means to belong, and most importantly, to the truth beneath every carefully curated surface." The silence that followed wasn't stunned. Not yet. It was simply confused. She lowered her glass, took a measured sip, and set it down. Then she picked up the tablet. "I've recently discovered something concerning, something that affects not just me, but all of us sitting at this table." She tapped the screen. The display linked instantly to the smart TV mounted above the fireplace. Martha's voice played first, clear and sharp in the room now quiet as snowfall. "Let her finish the renovation, then cut her loose. She's embarrassing." Vanessa's voice followed, unmistakable. "Make her pay for it all. She'll die alone anyway. Who would marry someone like that?" Bruce leaned forward, his chair creaking. "What is this, Grace?" Grace looked at him, her face unreadable. "That was recorded in this house 2 weeks ago. I've been documenting every financial transaction related to the renovation, along with all unauthorized withdrawals from the family vacation fund and the estate account." Martha stood halfway up. "You recorded us? That's illegal," Grace interrupted. "In the state of Texas, one-party consent applies. And I consented. Vanessa's smile had vanished. What are you trying to prove? Grace clicked again. A scanned email filled the screen, a trust restructuring agreement with Bruce's signature and digital timestamp. It showed the intent to exclude Grace from inheritance and consolidate all assets under Vanessa's name. Bruce pushed back from the table. This is taken out of context. Oh, I have context, Grace said calmly. She reached for the red-tabbed folder, sliding it across the table toward Ryan. Here's every receipt, every invoice I paid for. Over $57,000, 0 cents in documented contributions to this home. While I was building, you were plotting. Ryan flipped through the pages with growing unease. His fingers trembled. Dad? Grace said softly. Did you know Mom was having an affair? With Brant? Ryan's hand froze on a page. Martha went pale. You're lying, she said too quickly. Grace tapped once more. Once she is out, we move forward. Ryan doesn't suspect a thing. Everything will be ours. Brant's voice, unmistakable. The room fell into a vacuum. Ryan stood slowly. His wineglass tipped, shattering on the floor. He didn't react. Martha, he whispered, voice barely above a breath. How long? Her mouth opened, but no sound came. Grace didn't look away from her father. You've ignored me for years, but I still came home. I built you something solid. And while I was pouring concrete, they were pouring lies. Vanessa shot to her feet. You don't get to do this. This is my birthday. Grace smiled, the kind that didn't reach the eyes. Then make a wish. She turned back to the screen. And blow it out. For a moment, no one moved. The air in the dining room had thickened, saturated with disbelief, humiliation, and something far older, fear. The kind that lives under floorboards, the kind no one admits to, even when it leaks through the ceiling. Grace stood still at the head of the table, shoulders squared, her pulse steady beneath her collarbone. This was the moment she had built toward for weeks, years, if she was honest. No more second-guessing, no more shrinking. Ryan was the first to speak, his voice brittle. Is this true? He asked, not looking at Martha, still staring at the folder in front of him like it might catch fire. Martha's lips parted, but it wasn't speech. She looked smaller than Grace had ever seen her, like a woman halfway through molting, stuck between two skins. I never meant... He slammed his fist on the table. The sound cracked like a gunshot. You never meant? He thundered. What exactly did you mean, Martha? 10 years with Brant behind my back, using Grace's money to build a home for your betrayal? Vanessa's eyes darted from her mother to her father, calculating how far this would go. I don't know why we're making such a scene, she said, trying to regain footing. This is a family matter, not a courtroom. Grace turned to her, her expression calm but razor-edged. You're right, Vanessa. It's a family matter, which is why I brought the facts. Because the last time I trusted words in this house, I lost 10 years of my life trying to earn my place. Bruce cleared his throat, attempting lawyerly authority. Let's not escalate this further. Grace, if your concern is financial, I'm sure we can arrange a fair distribution. There's no need for threats. Grace laughed. Short, sharp. You think this is about money? She reached into her pocket and placed a second flash drive on the table. This is about erasure. You erased me from your plans, from your wills, from your future, but I kept receipts, not just of transactions, but of who I had to become to survive in this family. Martha finally found her voice. I did what I thought was best. No, Grace said. You did what was easiest. Vanessa was your reflection. I was your burden. But I built this house. I made this life, and you tried to steal it from under me. Ryan slowly lowered himself back into his chair, his face pale, his jaw clenched tight. When? He asked, quieter now. How long has it been, Martha? She closed her eyes. Since before Grace started the foundation. Ryan's breath caught. And you let her build this entire place while you knew you'd cut her out? Martha looked at Grace, almost pleading. You were never supposed to find out this way. Grace shook her head. You didn't think I'd find out at all. Silence fell again, heavier than before. Then with a sudden motion, Ryan shoved back from the table and stood. The leg of his chair screeched against the hardwood as he walked to the bar cabinet, pouring himself 2 fingers of scotch with shaking hands. He downed it in one gulp, then turned to his wife with eyes like cracked stone. "You've destroyed this family," he said, not Grace. He looked at his daughter then, really looked at her. For the first time in years, something shifted in his gaze, a flicker of shame, yes, but also recognition. "I should have seen it," he murmured. "You were the only one who ever stayed." Grace didn't blink. "And the only one who was never allowed in." The sound of breaking glass tore through the room a split second before the table flipped. It wasn't rage, not exactly. It was something colder, deeper. Ryan's silence had shattered like the wine goblet he'd sent flying, and with it the last pretense of the Whitman family myth. The mahogany table. Grace's table, slammed onto its side, scattering plates, silverware, and birthday cake across the hardwood floor in a violent clatter. Martha screamed. Vanessa gasped. Bruce ducked back, his phone clattering to the floor. But Grace didn't flinch. She stood, still and grounded, as if the explosion had passed through her and found no purchase. Her pulse didn't spike, her face remained calm. Ryan's chest heaved. "You robbed her," he spat at Martha. "Used her. My daughter." Martha backed toward the wall, shaking. "You never listened to me, Ryan. You were married to your work, to your columns and tenure and accolades. You left me alone in this house with a child who didn't fit the life I wanted." Grace felt the words hit her, not because they were new, but because of how casually her mother said them. As though her pain had been a mere inconvenience, a misfit tile in a polished floor. "So I was a disappointment," Grace said, voice level. "Because I built things instead of painting my nails. Because I wore boots instead of pearls," Martha snapped. "Because you reminded me of everything I gave up." The silence that followed was visceral. Vanessa, perhaps sensing the tide turning, stepped forward. "Mom made mistakes, okay? But we're still a family. We can figure this out. Privately." Grace turned to her sister. "No, Vanessa, we're not a family. Families don't make strategic plans to erase each other." Bruce, ever the opportunist, spoke next. "Legally, this isn't the place for declarations." "Grace, if you're seeking restitution or a stake in the estate, there are channels. You don't need to stage a dramatic ambush." Grace locked eyes with him. "This wasn't an ambush. This was an audit." Then she reached into her blazer and pulled out a manila envelope, placing it gently atop the mess on the floor. "These are restraining orders," she said, "filed yesterday morning against Martha Whitman, Vanessa Brooks, and Bruce Brooks. Effective immediately." Vanessa lunged forward. "You're kidding." Grace's stare didn't waver. "If you have 30 minutes to leave the property, you'll be escorted out if necessary. Everything you've built on deceit ends tonight." Bruce's face paled. "You don't have that kind of authority." "I do," said another voice. Everyone turned. At the archway stood a man in a charcoal suit, Dennis Lang, Grace's attorney, expression unreadable, a document folder in his hand. "I've been authorized by my client to deliver notice of a formal legal proceeding," he said calmly. "Given the compelling evidence of financial misappropriation, constructive fraud, and undue influence, we're seeking immediate injunction against any estate transfers, property claims, or trust restructuring initiated by the aforementioned parties." Ryan turned to Grace. "You brought a lawyer here?" "I brought the truth," she answered. Lang stepped forward and handed Bruce a sealed notice, then one to Vanessa. Finally, he offered one to Martha, who refused to take it. Lang laid it on the console table beside her instead, as if laying a wreath on a tombstone. "I suggest you begin packing," Grace said. "This home isn't yours anymore, not in name, not in blood." Martha's eyes brimmed with tears. Real ones, for once. "You'll regret this." Grace took a slow breath, stepping around the shattered glass, the ruined cake, the wreckage of a family that had never truly been one. "No," she said, "I regret waiting this long." The new condo wasn't grand. It didn't have vaulted ceilings or antique chandeliers, or an address people would whisper about at charity luncheons. It had wide windows that welcomed morning light, polished concrete floors, and silence. The kind of silence Grace Whitman had never known under the weight of her mother's judgment, or her sister's endless comparisons. She stood barefoot in the center of her living room, a mug of coffee warm between her hands, the scent of cedar and fresh drywall still lingering in the air. Outside, the lake shimmered beneath the pale winter sun. A heron skimmed the surface, its wings barely disturbing the glassy surface. It was a view she had chosen herself. She hadn't asked permission. She hadn't compromised. On the far side of the room, her work table stood beneath a wall of pinned drafts and sketches. Her latest project was spread out across the wood. Plans for a community workshop, a space she was funding to train young women in trades, carpentry, electrical work, framing, skills she had been told didn't belong to girls. Skills that had built her future. A knock came at the door. She didn't jump. She already knew who it was. When she opened it, Ryan stood there, a man stripped of pretense. No blazer, no leather briefcase, just a wool coat, tired eyes, and a folder in his hand. "I called ahead," he said quietly. Didn't want to impose. Grace stepped aside wordlessly, letting him in. He took in the space with a slow glance, pausing at the light spilling across the drafting table. "This is peaceful," he said. "I built it that way." He nodded, setting the folder down. "I won't take much of your time. I just came to deliver this in person." She waited. "It's the revised estate documents," he continued. "All assets, property, and investments are being transferred into a living trust under your name. No delays, no loopholes, no conditions." Grace didn't move toward the folder. "You're cutting them off completely?" Ryan exhaled. "They cut themselves off?" Silence stretched between them, not hostile, just unfinished. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said, voice low. "For a long time, I saw what I wanted to see, and what I didn't want to confront, I buried under lectures and wine and pretending things were fine." Grace folded her arms across her chest. "You were there, but you weren't present." "I know," he admitted, "but I'm here now, if that still means anything." She studied him for a long moment. For once there was no urge to fill the silence, no need to prove herself or minimize his guilt. It wasn't about blame anymore, it was about boundaries. "I don't want the past back," she said. "I don't want apologies rehearsed for closure. I want truth. From this moment forward, no edits." Ryan nodded slowly. "Truth, then." They stood in the quiet a moment longer before he gestured to the folder. "I left the rest with your attorney. I'll respect whatever you decide to do with it." As he turned to leave, he paused at the door. "You built something beautiful here, Grace. Not just this place. She didn't reply. Didn't need to. When the door closed behind him, Grace crossed the room and sat at her work table. She picked up her pencil and began sketching a new design. The lines came easily, measured, clean, strong, like her. The afternoon sun filtered through the wide windows, throwing soft rectangles of light across the floor like a quiet benediction. Grace sat still at her drafting table, pencil moving slowly over crisp paper. She wasn't sketching a building. Not yet. She was tracing outlines, space, flow, direction, shaping something new, not with ambition, but with clarity. This one would be for her. No clients, no contracts, a blueprint for living. Her phone buzzed on the table, cutting gently into the quiet. She picked it up and read the name with a detached calm. Martha Whitman. 14 messages in 3 days. Some furious, some weeping. One with a photo of the family's first Thanksgiving table and the words, "We can't throw this away." Grace didn't respond. She never would. She scrolled to the last one. Brant ended it. He went back to his wife. I have no one left. I never thought you'd be this cruel. She locked the phone and set it face down. There was no cruelty in truth. Only consequence. She stood, walked to the window, and watched as the wind rolled across the lake like a hand smoothing linen. In the distance, the reflection of sunlight shimmered against water, as if the world itself was rebuilding, layer by layer. There had been days, so many days, when Grace believed survival meant endurance, that if she gave enough, worked hard enough, loved silently enough, she'd be accepted. She had spent years treating loyalty as currency, hoping it would buy her a seat at the table she built. Now she understood. The only table that mattered was the one she chose to sit at. Alone, freely. The doorbell rang. This time she didn't expect it. Her body tensed reflexively, but when she opened the door, she was greeted by a familiar figure. Mrs. Rosa, from the old neighborhood. She held a small tin wrapped in a red ribbon. I found this in my freezer, she said with a smile. You made it for me 2 Christmases ago and insisted I keep half for emergencies. Grace laughed softly and took the tin. That sounds like me. Mrs. Rosa looked past her into the space. You always said you wanted a place where you could hear your own thoughts. Looks like you found it. I did. They stood quietly for a moment before Mrs. Rosa touched her arm. Your mother stopped by my porch the other day, she said. She asked if I'd pass along a message. I told her no. I said if Grace wanted to speak to you, she would, and if she didn't, she had every right. Grace's eyes stung, but not from pain, from recognition. Thank you, she whispered. After Rosa left, Grace returned to her table. She opened the tin and placed a cookie beside her sketch pad. Then she picked up a marker and titled the top of her newest design, Whitman Rebuilds a Place to Begin. It wouldn't just be a structure, it would be a sanctuary, a space for people who had been pushed aside, diminished, forgotten, a shelter made from the bones of old betrayals and the timber of new hope. As she drew, the sound of the world slipped away. There would be no press release, no final showdown, just this quiet, steady revolution, and when it was done, Grace would walk out onto the balcony, stand beneath the open sky, and breathe like she hadn't breathed in years. She hadn't destroyed her family, she'd simply refused to be buried beneath it, and now, with bare hands and an unshakable will, she was building something that would finally, irrevocably be her own. Thank you for staying with Grace until the very last page of her story. This wasn't just a tale of betrayal, it was a blueprint for freedom. A reminder that sometimes the people who build the most until they stop building for others and start rebuilding for themselves. If you've ever been underestimated, sidelined, or told you weren't enough, let this be your proof. You don't need their approval to rise. You only need the truth, the courage to face it, and the strength to walk away. Grace didn't burn the house down, she left the door open and walked into the light of her own life. Thank you for watching, and if this story spoke to you, remember, you're not alone. Your blueprint for freedom is waiting. See you in the next story.